Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And in this episode of the podcast, we're going to sort of move away from talking about a particular historical person and event, and we're going to look at something that's in the news now, and that is a leak, a government leak. In this case, of course, the leak is from the United States Supreme Court. And of course, everybody's trying to figure out who leaked what, who leaked this draft ruling, and everybody's speculating. But we want to talk a little bit about leaks, and I guess the Supreme Court as well. And by the way, before I turn it over to Chris, we have already done an episode on the Supreme Court, at least one that I can remember, Chris. So I would encourage our listeners to go back and listen to those episodes. So Chris, we're talking about leaks today.
Yeah, and I think that in today's society, we usually talk about events and people, and we have some really good discussions, but I think that this is so in the news that it was something that we definitely had to talk about. We don't really have to talk about the cases per se, but I think that we just need to talk about the really magnitude of this leak and the repercussions that it could have, because let's be honest, the Supreme Court, though it is a very tightly run ship, there's been leaks in the past. But this leak is coming during a time when there's already distrust in politics, in the government. There's distrust in the White House. There's distrust in Congress. And for the longest time, Ray, I think that the Supreme Court kind of stayed away from those things. Yes, there was talk about court packing, and there was talk about, these things and those things, but really the court had stayed away from it. But through this leak, the floodgates have just opened wide, and you now are going to start seeing individuals that are going to, I don't know. I think the best thing is that it's pretty much going to cast a dark cloud over the Supreme Court. So maybe, Ray, we just kind of need to give a quick introduction about what the leak references and kind of how it came about. I think that's good to do.
Yeah. And I think what you're touching on before we get to that's the issue of legitimacy. The court has maintained, I think, at least in most areas of American society, an air of legitimacy. Whereas Congress, their approval ratings is always very low. The president, depending on who the president might be and what's going on at the given time, their approval rating may be pretty high or maybe very, very low. But I think the court, for the most part, like you said, has maintained that air of legitimacy. And I think the real danger here, with this particular leak and all the stuff, the firestorm that has followed, I think the danger here, like you said, is it loses that air of legitimacy. It's sort of people grow more distrustful of the court than they have. And I've already seen it where people are, saying very negative things about the court. And I always want to remind people when they do that, I always want to say, it was established in Article 3 of the Constitution. So it's a very important branch of the government.
And while it is true that there is politics on the court, the reality is that each justice is sworn to uphold what the Constitution says, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And each justice is required to lay aside any political views, religious views, personal, moral, social views, and everything that they look at has to be looked at from the eyes of the law, from the eyes of the Constitution. And in this situation, it comes about with probably one of the most well-known court cases that has been decided in probably the 20th century, 21st century, and that's Roe v. Wade. And what is interesting with this is with the previous president and with this president, there's been a lot of discussion. Well, depending on who you put on the court, has the potential to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that could create a political firestorm, if you will. And a lot of people were upset when President Trump put on to the Supreme Court 3 individuals. And we talked about that, as you mentioned in a previous podcast. And then President Biden has had the opportunity to put somebody on the Supreme Court. But many people feared that the day would come in which there might be the possibility of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, whether that happens or not, what the main issue that we're looking at is that somebody found out before the actual ruling was given. And so I think it's important for us to kind of go back and look, if we will, about how the Supreme Court works when it talks about hearing cases and things of that nature. So to be a Supreme Court justice, there's only 9 of them, and it's the highest degree you could ever get if you're a lawyer or judge or something like that. And each judge has the right to hire 4 law clerks to work with them during a particular term for 1 year. And so each justice looks at hundreds of qualified applicants, and they look at top grades. They come from a tier 1 law school like Harvard or Brown or Yale, or from one of these really very prestigious law schools. And with all of these stories, with all of these connections, the judges basically get 4. So that's a total of 36 clerks that are going to work with the justices. And so as they are selected, what then happens is they pretty much, these clerks can influence a judge's thinking. They look at the cases. They make recommendations about which cases the court can hear. A clerk basically operates in concert with the justice. And Ray, I think that this is so important because clerks are responsible for researching case law. So they dive into what the Constitution says, what previous cases have said, and they just read these petitions, they read these writings, and then they're given the opportunity to actually write a draft of what the judge, based on their understanding, what the judge is thinking, what the judge is possibly doing. So they write that draft. So for this case, we're talking about Justice Alito, right? So there's a good possibility that this draft that's been published was the work of a clerk who understood what Alito usually thinks and who's done their case law, has done all of these things, and basically drafts an opinion. And then the justice reads it, decides, whether they like it or they don't like it, makes changes, makes revisions, things of that nature. But Ray, I found it interesting that there was a study that was done that said 30% of the opinions issued by the court are usually the entire work of the law clerk. That the justice basically says, yes, I agree with you, sign off. That's a lot of power for a 30-something-year-old law clerk to have that opportunity to work alongside and draft these cases.
Yeah, it is a lot of power. And when you think about it, these are the people who, they're researching, they're drafting, they're talking with the justice that they work for or work with. They're talking with each other, probably, I can imagine. And so they have the inside track. If anybody knows what is going on in the mind of the justices, what they are thinking about, these clerks, those are the people that are doing it.
Yeah, Justice Thomas, one time when they were talking about how do you hire clerks, how do you bring about clerks, he said, I won't hire clerks who have a profound disagreement with me. Right. And somebody said, why is that? And he said this, he said, it's like trying to train a pig. It wastes your time and it aggravates the pig. Yeah. So the people that he brings on, they think like him. He's gone through the interview process with them. They know his thoughts. He knows their thoughts. And so he's going to bring somebody in that has the same philosophy, the same methodology, the same philosophy, all of those things that the justice has. And so, they also, if you think about this, they have the power to shape policy. They also have the power to set precedent. And by the way, Ray, if you are a clerk for a Supreme Court, you're basically guaranteed a job after your 1-year term with the judge to work in the most prestigious law firms in America. And you're going to have a 6-figure salary, but there's reports that says you'll get a sign-in bonus of $300,000 if you previously worked for a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, Means I went into the wrong field. But yeah, I mean, I would think that these clerks would have to be ideologically matched with the justice for whom they are serving. I mean, it wouldn't do well. You talk about Clarence Thomas to have a liberal um, clerk, or for Ruth Bader Ginsburg to have a conservative clerk. It really wouldn't work. And I don't think the two would even want to work together necessarily. So these people do have, like I said, the inside track. They know what these justices are thinking. So when it comes to leaks, and I don't want to point the finger at anybody, because of course we don't know, as far as I know, we don't know who leaked this draft. But a clerk is certainly someone who would have access to the draft, but not necessarily a clerk for Alito. It could have been a clerk for another justice who, for whatever reason, thought the public needs to hear about this, whether it was pro what is in the draft or whether it was con what's in the draft. They think maybe public pressure might move the justice a little bit. What do you think about the idea that a justice could be influenced by, for example, the protest on the porch of the Supreme Court, or outside the house of Kavanaugh? I believe they're outside the house of Kavanaugh, and I think Alito as well. Do you think these justices can be swayed by that?
Yeah. So if I can, I'd like to go back in. For me, and I'm a lover of the court. I know a lot about the history of the court. This is probably one of my favorite topics to discuss. I would just say I would find it very hard to believe that the leaker would be a clerk of the court for several reasons. Number one, it's a career ender for the law clerk.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to be caught, which I think the person will be ultimately caught, I mean, I just said you're giving up a $300,000 signing bonus. I mean, you're giving up the opportunity to be in the top law firm in the United States. I mean, these are Ivy League educated individuals. I mean, they have the highest ambitions. We have 3 Supreme Court justices who were actually law clerks. So, I mean, there is that idea that, hey, if I'm clerking for a Supreme Court justice, there's the possibility that, I might have the opportunity to get up there. I mean, so they know the rules, and they know, I mean, there's only 36 of them. I mean, that's a pretty tough thing. So I don't think it's that person. Now let's go back to this conservative ideology or this liberal ideology. Well, conservatives think that, a liberal might have leaked it so that it could possibly influence the outcome, right? So, hey, they're thinking about doing this. You guys need to go protest in front of their homes. You need to go and do those. Now, Chief Justice John Roberts said, listen, y'all can talk all you want. You can try to do whatever you want. It's not going to sway our opinion. We are firm in what we believe, and that's how it's going to be. So, you kind of have that. I don't think that it's going to sway a colleague. I don't think it's going to, reset expectations. I don't think that would mean so. But if you think about as far as the, why would a conservative do it? Well, conservative could do it for the simple reason of saying, well, your name's out there on the record now, right? So if you go and change your opinion, then, you're going to have the people all over you because you basically changed your opinion because you did bow down to pressure. So I find it hard that it could be a clerk, and I also find it hard that it would even be a justice. It just can't happen. So now there's other people in the court that do see this, right? I mean, so there are other people in the court, but I mean, Ray, we have to understand, if we go back and look at how this all developed, it wasn't just one leak. There were actually 3 leaks that went down. One of them was to the Politico was the main one that kind of broke it, but one of them actually went to, I think, the Wall Street Journal and basically said, hey, what we know is that they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. So that was kind of like the first one that went out, and then the second one that went out that was from Politico, and I basically think what they said is, hey, we know it's going to be overturned, but we don't really know who it's going to be. And, I think that was something to be said, that we know it will be Alito because he wrote it. We know that Thomas always goes with Alito. They're side by side. But there were some people thinking that the names weren't leaked per se because Chief Justice was trying to maybe sway a couple of the newer justices to maybe say, hey, this is going to cause a big stink. Maybe not, let's not do this. I don't know. But there's 3 leaks, one saying it's going to be overturned. The second one basically said it was going to be 5 members of the court who were going to overturn it. And then the third one, of course, was the actual, I think, 89-page ruling, which it's, if anybody's interested in it, but you can find it online. It's pretty interesting how he tries to justify if it's true. But, Ray, what's the other thing we have to remember? This was a draft written in February.
Yeah, that's something that I try to keep in the back of my mind is this was a draft written in February, and the Supreme Court had released a statement along with Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, that it does not necessarily reflect where the court is right now or where the justices are right now. So as far as we know, I don't know that things would change drastically, but as far as we know, there may already be some shifting around that has occurred even before the leak, but maybe not. I mean, maybe the leak shows that the justices had not changed their positions that much. And the person, for whatever reason, you mentioned 2 possible reasons, thought leaking it was necessary because things weren't changing.
So let me ask you a question. Let's talk about the 4th branch of government. We've got the executive branch, we've got the legislative branch, we've got the judicial branch, but there's also this group that would seem to say that the 4th branch of government is the media. So what role does the media play in this? And here's the ethical, right? So let's say that you are a reporter and you get a scoop such as this, and the ramifications of publicizing this, right? You know that if you put this to writing, that it is going to cause a huge, Ray, we're not talking about inflation. We're not talking about the rise of price of gas. We're not talking about the war. We're talking about a leak. So do you hold it as a journalist for integrity purposes, knowing that this is a leak, that this was given to you not, in the proper stance, because everybody knows that the Supreme Court issues their opinions off the bench, right? They do it on a special way. What role does the media have in this? Should they take any ownership that maybe what they did was wrong, or did what they do was right because it's reporting?
Well, I think there's 2 things that go into that. First, obviously, is you want to be the first organization to get this story, the scoop, as they used to say. You want to be the first organization to be able to publish this leaked draft ruling of the court. You think about it. If come June or whenever this particular ruling is officially released and whatever it says, if it does overturn Roe, and you are the folks at Politico, you're going to go down in history as the first people to really break this story because you're the one who got your hands on this draft. It reminds me, one of my favorite movies of all of recent years is The Post with Tom Hanks. I don't know if you've seen that movie. And it's about the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Basically, what happened was this guy called Daniel Ellsberg photocopied all these documents that showed that several presidential administrations had not been honest with the American people about what was going on in Vietnam. And of course, it was published in the New York Times and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there is that angle. We want to be the ones that are going to go down in history as publishing this very important story, the one that's going to be the first to get the story. And of course, we cannot talk about leaks and not talk about Watergate, in that particular angle. So I guess if you're a reporter, you're looking at it from the standpoint of this is potentially history in the making. And I want to be on the front line of history. Sometimes they say that, news is the first draft of history. And somebody says, I want to be on the front line of that. And so they're looking at it from that perspective. I think the second thing that we have to think about is, let's not divorce ideology from this. A lot of people in the news media have very strong opinions on Roe and on Roe v. Wade, and it's certainly possible that that's driving some of this as well.
It's interesting that this Roe v. Wade is the subject of a leak in 2022, because it was actually the subject of a leak in 1973, I think, when it was discovered that, hey, we know what's going to happen. And I think it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times. I don't remember which one it was. And so I'm sorry to whichever organization if I get it wrong. But they ran a story about the outcome of the case. So they were going to go ahead and tell everybody, we know what's going to happen with Roe v. Wade. We're going to let you know, even though that the ruling had yet to be issued. And the Chief Justice at the time was Warren Burger. Fascinating individual to study. People might know him from the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But he demanded a meeting with the Times. And he sat down with those guys and he said, listen, I'm gonna tell you something. I am extremely infuriated. And he said, from now on, I'm instituting a 20-second rule for the court's law clerks. And his 20-second rule was, if there's any clerk that ever talks to a reporter, they'll be fired within 20 seconds. I mean, that's how he felt about that. And Ray, something else that I discovered is that, talking about leaks, I did some leaks about Supreme Court, it was that one. There was also a leak of, it's very little known. Nobody really knows about it, but it was about a sexual discrimination case, I think in 1981. And the newspaper got a hold of it, and they understood this is what's going to happen. We know it, but they didn't report it because they couldn't confirm its authenticity. So they knew they had it in their hands, but they were like, I don't know. It's one of those judgment calls, as you were mentioning. Do we be the first one with the scoop, or do we not be the first one in the scoop? So I don't know if we should or if we shouldn't. And Ray, this isn't something new. We mentioned Roe v. Wade. We mentioned this one in 1981, but also I believe that the Dred Scott decision was leaked also. And that goes way on back, which ultimately held that African descent couldn't be U.S. citizens. So that was huge.
That was connected to the inauguration of James Buchanan, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It was either the day of his inauguration or a few days later that the ruling was released.
Politically motivated.
Yeah.
So you have to see that, whether it's Watergate, you mentioned Watergate, why was that leak done? Politically motivated. Mm-hmm. The Pentagon Papers, why was that done? Politically motivated. Vietnam War, right? You've got a guy who's in office. A lot of people are looking to get, that whole thing. James Buchanan, that's politically motivated. Roe v. Wade is politically motivated. The problem is that 2022 Roe v. Wade is different than 1973 Roe v. Wade. It's different than Dred Scott. It's different than that other one, because we are living in a 24-hour news cycle that really isn't focused on news, but is focused on opinion piece and trying to get you to buy into a particular ideology, as you mentioned. That's what's scary about this, because I don't, John Roberts said it was an egregious betrayal. I don't know if you ever get back trust into the Supreme Court. I don't know if you get back trust into Congress. I don't know if you get back trust into the White House with these leaks. And there was a leak with the impeachment of Donald Trump, right? Wasn't that the phone call or something? Wasn't that some leak? I think so. All of these leaks that are coming, Ray, how do we get back to the point where we can say, I trust that these branches of government are acting for the best interest of our nation and not for a particular group?
I don't think we can. I think, you talk about the 24-hour quote news media unquote, which, like you said, it's a lot of opinion and political talk. but between that and social media, I don't think we can ever go back to the day where, people trusted the president or where people trusted the court. I think those days, unfortunately, are gone. And I do think, Chris, that is dangerous for the nation. I think it poses significant problems for the nation. One thing I was thinking about, though, when I was listening to you, and I had to write it down so I remember it, is how leaks have changed from a technological standpoint. I think about 1971 and the Pentagon paper leak. Daniel Ellsberg had to photocopy these documents. He had to, sneak these documents in a box or whatever.
Yeah.
Nowadays, all somebody's got to do is drag and drop a file into an email, drag and drop a file into a Google Drive or Dropbox, or put it on a flash drive. I mean, it can be done very easily nowadays. And, leaks aren't, you don't, I mean, I guess maybe it still happens where, people meet at a phone booth or whatever, like you see in the movies. But nowadays it's so much easier, a text message, just so much easier to get that information out than it was even in 1971, probably, even in the early 2000s. It's much easier now than it was then. So, I think because of that, unfortunately, and for other reasons, the curtain's been pulled back. I mean, when I go back to the late 18th century with President George Washington, he was, especially during his first term, he was one of the most trusted, if not the most trusted man in America for a period of time. And I don't think we could ever get back to that. Or Franklin Delano Roosevelt giving his fireside chats where people listened to him and what he was saying, comforted them in the midst of the Depression and gave them confidence in the banks, gave them confidence in the economy and that kind of thing. I don't know that we can ever return to those days. I think those days may be gone forever.
People would also need to be reminded that this leak is a crime. I mean, if the person who received this is sworn to the rules and the regulations of the Supreme Court, and by passing out this information that is not of their own, that is not theirs, to another source, as Chief Justice has said, it will be punishable to the fullest extent of the law. And, I know that newspapers and media are, they have this oath, they will protect their sources, to make sure that the news is produced and shared. But I'm saddened by this, because I agree with you that I don't know if we get back to where we once were with the ones that you mentioned. And, what does that share as for times to come? That leads to a whole lot more things about technology in society, about ethics in society, about politics in society. I mean, I think you talked about pulling back the curtain, but this is also opening up Pandora's box, because there are some who are going to say, well, we have a right to know. We have a right to try to get them to sway their opinion, if you will. And that's my problem with protesting a Supreme Court justice, trying to get them to sway them. Lawyers have an hour to argue before the Supreme Court to be able to share what they believe is the law. This is not a judge. It's not a jury. It's not evidence. It's not case. When it gets to the Supreme Court, it is a matter of the Constitution. Does what has happened, does it align with the Constitution? That's all this is about. And when you try to get public opinion in polling to sway somebody's opinion on what the Constitution says, I think that's something the founding fathers never imagined would happen.
Yeah, I think what both sides, pro-Roe, anti-Roe, I think a lesson that both of these sides can take away, and I'm sure right now neither one of them need to be convinced of this, and that is that elections matter. I wrote that down in my notes here with the exclamation point. Elections matter. Who wins the presidency matters. I remember not too many years ago, you would hear people say, well, I don't vote because it doesn't matter. And now we see that Yeah, it does matter who you put in the White House, who you put in the Senate. These are going to be the people that are going to determine who's on the court. And those are people, like we pointed out in the episode on the Supreme Court, those are the people who are going to have an influence on the law of the nation and the direction of the nation for 20, 30 years, which is a very long time.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about the case. We were just talking about leaks. And so, I mean, this is just one case of many that will, have ramifications. I mean, every Supreme Court case has a very big role in American society. So, while there's one case, the Roe v. Wade, our podcast today wasn't about Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. Our podcast is about the sanctity of democracy, about the Supreme Court, and in any branch of government. So, Ray, I think that this is true history you should know, because we need to understand how each branch has a very powerful say in government affairs, including the media, but also in how we are to absorb everything that we learn each and every day through news cycles, media, social media, and just everyday conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris, for a great discussion. I hope our listeners will share this podcast and this episode with their family and friends. Share it on your social media site. You can find our podcast on Sounder FM, Spotify, Google, and other places where you listen to your podcast. If you have a podcast comment, question, suggestion, you can place it on Facebook, on Twitter, or you can email us at historyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know at gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk at you later.